The coffee was already cold by the time I noticed his porch light was still on. That was wrong. Ray Calloway turned his porch light off at 7:15 every morning, same as he'd done every morning for the past 22 years, right after he came out in his gray robe and picked up the newspaper from the bottom step. I knew this the way you know the sound of your own refrigerator. Not because you paid attention, but because it had been there so long that its absence became the thing you noticed. It was 8:40. I stood at my kitchen window with a mug of cold coffee and told myself it didn't mean anything. People slept late. People forgot things. People changed their routines after 22 years without feeling obligated to inform their neighbor across the street. I was 53 years old and I had no business standing at a window watching for a man I'd never once invited inside my house. But I should start at the beginning. Ray and I moved onto Alderman Street within 3 weeks of each other, back in the fall of 2001. I came first, a newly divorced 31-year-old with a U-Haul, a mattress, and the specific kind of optimism that looks a lot like exhaustion if you catch it at the wrong angle. I'd bought the house because it was cheap, and because I needed to be somewhere that wasn't the apartment I'd shared with my ex-wife Karen, where every room still smelled like her shampoo, and every silence sounded like an argument we'd already had. Ray arrived on a Tuesday. I remember because I was sitting on my front steps drinking a beer. Too early in the day for a beer, honestly, but the divorce had given me certain permissions I hadn't asked for. When a blue pickup truck pulled into the driveway across the street, a man got out. Medium height, dark hair going gray at the temples, the kind of forearms that come from actual work and not from a gym. He had a cardboard box under each arm and a look on his face like someone who had made a decision and was still deciding whether it had been the right one. He glanced across the street. I raised my beer. He nodded once, not a smile, not unfriendly, just an acknowledgement, and carried his boxes inside. That was it. That was the beginning. The wave developed naturally over the following weeks. It wasn't discussed or agreed upon. It simply happened the way habits happen, through repetition and proximity, and the particular way that two people can settle into a rhythm without ever talking about it. He came out in the morning. I came out in the morning. We saw each other. We raised a hand. We went back inside. 22 years of that. Every single morning except for the times one of us was traveling, and even then I'd sometimes catch myself raising a hand toward an empty porch before I remembered. What I knew about Ray Calloway after 22 years of living across the street from him could fill maybe half a page of notebook paper. He worked in construction, or had, until about 5 years ago. I knew this from the truck, from the way he moved, from the occasional Saturday when I'd see him in his driveway doing something careful and methodical to a piece of wood with tools I didn't know the names of. He was retired now, or close to it. The truck sat in the driveway more days than not. He had a son, Tommy. I knew Tommy's name because I'd heard Ray say it once, firmly, across the yard, in the tone fathers use when a child is about to do something that will end in stitches. Tommy was maybe 7 or 8 then, which would make him close to 30 now. He came around maybe twice a year in a car with out-of-state plates. They'd sit on the porch, the two of them, and I'd find reasons to be near my front window. Ray had been married. I knew this from the woman I'd seen moving boxes out of the house sometime around 2008 with the quiet efficiency of someone who had packed up her life once before and knew how to do it without making a production of it. I never knew her name. Ray never mentioned her. The morning after the moving truck left, he came out at the usual time in the usual robe and picked up the newspaper from the usual step, and I raised my hand, and he raised his, and that was that. I had never been inside his house. He had never been inside mine. We had spoken, actually spoken, with words, maybe 40 times in 22 years. Mostly about the weather, or the Hendersons 2 doors down who let their dog dig up everyone's yard, or the time a tree branch came down in the storm of 2015 and landed exactly on the property line, and we'd stood there together for 10 minutes working out whose job it was to move it. He smelled like sawdust, and something else I'd never been able to identify. Cedar, maybe. I knew this from the 2 or 3 times we'd been close enough. The tree branch incident, a handshake on New Year's Day 5 years ago when we'd both happened to be outside at midnight, a moment in 2019 when he'd caught my mail by accident and crossed the street to return it. His hand had been warm. I remembered that specifically and without meaning to. I had told no one any of this. So, by 9:15, the porch light was still on and I had washed the same 3 dishes 4 times. The thing about a habit that long is that when it breaks, your body notices before your brain does. I hadn't decided to worry. I was simply standing at the window, very still, the way you go still when a sound stops that you didn't know you'd been listening to. I thought about the reasonable explanations. He'd slept late. He was sick. He'd gone somewhere early before I was up and forgotten the light. His son was visiting and they'd stayed up late and the morning routine had simply not happened yet. All of these were reasonable. None of them moved me away from the window. Here is the thing about Ray Calloway that I had never said out loud. Not to anyone. Not even to myself in the specific language that would make it real. I had organized a not insignificant portion of my daily life around those 30 seconds on the porch every morning. The coffee was always made by 7. I was always dressed, or at least presentable. I was always at the window or near the door, not waiting exactly, but available. Ready. The way you're ready for something you've been pretending isn't going to happen for 22 years. I set down my mug. I picked up my keys. I put my keys down. I looked at the phone. I didn't have his number. We had never exchanged numbers because the wave had always been enough. Because the wave had always been the whole point. At 9:30, I put my shoes on and crossed the street. My heart was doing something undignified. I was a 53-year-old man walking across a residential street on a Tuesday morning in October, and my heart was doing something it had no business doing at this stage of my life and at this hour of the morning. I noted this with the distant embarrassment of someone watching themselves do something foolish and being unable to stop. I knocked on Ray Calloway's door for the first time in 22 years. Silence. Then, footsteps. Slow, but there. The door opened. He looked terrible. Not sick terrible, not emergency terrible, but the specific terrible of a man who had not slept and was not going to tell you why. Gray robe, bare feet, hair that had been slept on wrong. He looked at me with an expression I couldn't read. Not surprise exactly, but something adjacent to it. Like a man who had been expecting someone and was not sure whether to be relieved or unsettled that it was me. Danny, he said. He knew my name. Of course he knew my name. I knew his. But hearing it in his voice, that particular low morning voice, was somehow startling. Your light was on, I said, because that was the whole explanation and also none of it. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he looked at the porch light, still burning pale in the October morning. Then he looked back at me. You want to come in? He said. I had waited 22 years for that sentence without knowing I was waiting for it. Yeah, I said. I do. Me to move out there with them. Said they'd find a place nearby. Said the grandkids would like having me around. You have grandkids? He looked up at me. The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile, but the architecture of one. 2. Girl and a boy, Emma and Jake, 4 and 6. He paused. You didn't know that. No, I said. I didn't. We looked at each other across the kitchen table. Really looked, the way we'd never quite managed from across the street. And I think we both felt the specific weight of that. 22 years. 2 grandchildren I didn't know existed. A son whose name I'd heard once shouted across a yard when he was 7 years old. The full strangeness of how much life could happen across a street from another life without any of it crossing over. Are you going? I asked. To Portland. He looked back at his coffee. A long pause. The kind of pause that has a shape to it. I don't know, he said. Smaki. We sat in that kitchen for 2 hours. I don't know how to explain how that happened. There was no moment where we decided to keep talking. It simply continued, the way a fire continues if you don't take away the wood. He refilled the coffee. I stopped noticing the awkwardness. We talked about Tommy, about Portland, about the specific grief of watching a child build a life that doesn't include you the way you'd imagined. We talked about the Henderson's dog, which had apparently destroyed Ray's garden 2 summers ago in a way he was still not entirely over. We talked about the tree branch from 2015, which we both remembered differently and argued about mildly and without any heat. It was easy. That was the thing that unsettled me most. After 22 years of 30-second waves across a street, it was immediately, disarmingly easy to sit in Ray Calloway's kitchen and talk to him like a person. Like I'd always known how. Like I'd simply never tried before. Why did you never come over before? He asked, somewhere in the second hour. Not accusatory, just the question, plain and honest. I thought about how to answer that. The honest answer was complicated and I wasn't ready to give it. So I gave the next honest thing, which was, I don't know. Seemed like we had a good thing going. He looked at me for a moment. The wave, he said. The wave, I agreed. I used to wonder, he said, what you'd say if you crossed over, what the first thing would be. He turned his mug again. Figured it'd be about the weather. Your light was on, I said. Close enough. Something shifted when he said that. Just slightly, just enough. The temperature of the room, maybe. Or maybe just the temperature of the conversation. I looked at the table. He looked at the window. Outside, the October light was doing what October light does in the Midwest. Going golden and a little sad. The way it does when summer has been over long enough that you've stopped mourning it and started accepting it. I looked for you, I said. Every morning. I always looked. I hadn't meant to say that. It came out the way things come out when you've been sitting with someone long enough that your defenses start to get tired. I heard it in the air between us and had a brief, vivid wish that I could reach out and take it back. Ray didn't say anything. He set his mug down very carefully on the table. He looked at it. Then he looked at me, and his expression was something I'd never seen on his face from across the street. Couldn't have, from that distance. It was the expression of a man who has just heard something that requires him to recalibrate a significant number of things he thought he understood. Danny, he said, then stopped. You don't have to, I started. I looked for you too, he said. Quiet. Flat. The way you say something when you've decided to say it and have gone past the point of softening it. Every morning, 22 years. I looked for you too. The refrigerator hummed. The October light moved across the kitchen floor. Neither of us said anything for what felt like a very long time. Here is what I knew about myself. In the kitchen of Ray Calloway's house on a Tuesday morning in October, at the age of 53, I had been divorced for 22 years. I had not been in a relationship since. Not because there hadn't been opportunities. There had been a few, women mostly, one man briefly and carefully, in a way that felt like testing a floor to see if it would hold, but because none of them had felt like anything in particular. I had attributed this to being generally bad at intimacy, which my ex-wife Karen had suggested once during an argument, and which I had since promoted to a personal truth without ever examining it too closely. What I had not examined was the fact that the longest consistent relationship of my adult life had been a 30-second wave with a man across the street. What I had not examined was the way I'd arranged my mornings around those 30 seconds for 22 years without ever asking myself why. What I had not examined was what it meant that the prospect of him moving to Portland felt like something being taken from me, something I'd never technically had. I was examining it now, in his kitchen, with his eyes on me. The thing about being 53 and finally looking at something you've been not looking at for 22 years is that it doesn't feel like a revelation. It feels like a door you've been walking past every day finally being open, and you look through it, and on the other side is just a room. A room that was always there. Ordinary and specific and yours if you want it. I should go, I said. Because I was 53, and I had spent 53 years being careful, and I didn't know how to stop being careful in a single morning. Ray nodded. He stood when I stood. He walked me to the door the way people walk guests to the door, which was strange because I had never been a guest here before, and now I was leaving, and I didn't know if I would ever come back inside or if we would simply return to the wave tomorrow morning and never speak of any of this. At the door, I turned. Ray! Yeah. Are you going to decide about Portland? He leaned against the doorframe, crossed his arms, looked at me with an expression I was starting to be able to read. Careful, and underneath the careful, something else. I was going to say yes last night, he said, before Tommy called. I'd been thinking about it for a week, and I was going to say yes. Get out of this house, be near the grandkids, start something new. He paused. Then he called, and I said I'd think about it, and I couldn't sleep, and I don't know why. He looked at me steadily when he said that last part. I do, I thought. I think you might know why. I didn't say that. I said, let me know what you decide. Danny. Yeah. Come back tomorrow for coffee. Not a question. If you want. 22 years. One morning. One door. Yeah, I said. I want. I crossed the street back to my house and stood in my own kitchen and looked at his door from my window for a long time. The porch light was still on. Then, at 10:47 in the morning, it went off. I laughed. Out loud, alone in my kitchen, for the first time in, I couldn't remember how long. I went back the next morning, and the morning after that, and the one after that. It happened quietly, the way the wave had happened. through repetition and proximity and the particular ease of two people who had apparently been ready for this for a very long time without knowing it. By the end of the first week, I was crossing the street at 8 o'clock every morning with my own mug, because Ray's coffee was good, but I was particular about my mug, and Ray had stopped looking surprised to see me, which felt like progress of a kind I couldn't quite name. We talked. That was the simple version of it. The longer version was that we talked about everything and nothing in the specific way of people who are learning each other late, with a kind of focused attention that you lose in your 20s and don't get back until you're old enough to understand what it costs to waste it. He told me about the construction work, 28 years of it, the satisfaction of building something with your hands that would outlast you. I told him about the accounting firm, 20 years of other people's numbers, the quiet usefulness of making order out of mess. He told me about growing up in rural Ohio, the youngest of 4 boys, a family that communicated primarily through silence and football. I told him about growing up in Chicago, an only child, a mother who talked constantly, and a father who read, and the strange way those two things had shaped me into someone who listened carefully and said very little. We talked about the marriages, his, mine, carefully, the way you talk about things that still have some tenderness in them. His wife Linda had left in 2008, he said. Not dramatically, not because of anything specific. Just the slow drift of two people who had wanted the same things at 25 and discovered at 45 that they had become different people without discussing it. They were civil now. She'd been at Tommy's wedding. They'd stood next to each other for photographs, and it had been fine. And that was the thing about fine. Sometimes it was the saddest word in the language. I told him about Karen. The same slow drift, essentially. The discovery that I had been performing a version of myself for so long that I'd lost track of what was underneath. She hadn't been cruel about it. She'd just said, very quietly, in the kitchen of the apartment we'd shared for 6 years, that she didn't think I was really there. Not entirely. That some part of me was always somewhere else. She wasn't wrong. I just hadn't known, at 31, where that somewhere else was. I thought about telling him where I'd eventually figured it out. I didn't. Not yet. So, the almost moment happened on a Thursday, 11 days into the new habit. We were at his workbench in the backyard. He'd been showing me the half-finished piece under the tarp, which turned out to be a rocking chair for Emma, his granddaughter. He was explaining the joinery, which I didn't understand technically, but found I could follow emotionally. The way the pieces were meant to fit together, the importance of the grain, the reason you couldn't rush the drying. I was standing close, closer than I normally stood to people. He was pointing at something on the chair's arm, and I leaned in to see, and our shoulders touched. He didn't move away. I didn't move away. We stood like that for maybe 4 seconds, which is a very long time for two people who are pretending not to notice that they're touching. And then he said, very normally, "See how the grain runs here?" And I said, "Yeah," in a voice that came out lower than I intended. And then he took a half step to the left, and the moment ended, and we both looked at the chair with great concentration for a moment. On the way home, I stood in my kitchen and looked at my hands for a while. I was 53 years old. I had not been this aware of 4 seconds since I was a teenager. I found this both absurd and, underneath the absurd, something that felt uncomfortably like joy. Sonia. Ray called Tommy that Saturday and told him he wasn't moving to Portland. He told me this on Monday morning, plainly, the way he told me most things. Without decoration, without explanation, just the fact laid on the table between the coffee mugs. I said, "That's a big decision." He said he knew. I said, "Are you sure?" He looked at me across the table with an expression that was not quite a smile and said he was sure. I did not ask him why. He did not tell me. We both understood that the answer was in the room already and didn't need to be spoken to be real. The mornings continued. They expanded. Coffee became coffee and a walk sometimes, a loop around the neighborhood that took 45 minutes and felt like 10. He knew the name of every dog on the block and most of their owners. He'd lived here longer than I had, came in 2001, same as me, but had somehow embedded himself in the street in a way I hadn't. Mrs. Patterson at the corner, who was 81 and grew tomatoes. The Nguyens, who had twins that Ray had watched grow from infants to teenagers through the window. The Kellermans, whose marriage was apparently in trouble based on observable evidence that Ray enumerated with the neutral precision of a man who paid attention and kept his mouth shut about what he saw. I had lived on this street for 22 years and learned more about it in 2 weeks of morning walks than in all the years before. I told him this. He said that was because I'd always been in a hurry on the mornings before. I said I hadn't been in a hurry. I just had somewhere to be. He said that was the same thing. I said it wasn't. He gave me the look he'd developed for when he thought I was wrong and was too polite to say so directly, which was a look I'd grown unreasonably fond of in a very short period of time. The second almost moment was bigger. And then, immediately after it, everything went wrong. It was a Friday evening. The first evening, because until then it had always been mornings. He'd texted me, which was new and which I had spent an embarrassing amount of time looking at on my phone. Got too much chili. Come over if you want. 5 words. I read them 6 times. I went over. We ate chili at the kitchen table and he'd put on some music. Low, something country and old that I didn't know the name of, but that fit the kitchen and the October dark outside the window perfectly. We had a beer each, then another. The conversation went somewhere it hadn't been before. Not deeper exactly, but wider. He talked about being lonely in a way he hadn't before, with the specific frankness that comes from a second beer in a dark kitchen and someone who has been showing up every morning for 3 weeks. It gets old, he said. The quiet. I used to like the quiet. Now it's just, I don't know, heavy. Yeah, I said, because I knew exactly what he meant and had no better words for it either. You've been, he started, then stopped, looked at his beer. The mornings have been good, these past few weeks. Yeah, I said again, eloquent. He looked up. The kitchen light was warm and low, and it did something to the angles of his face that I registered and then tried not to register. He was looking at me the way he'd been looking at me more often lately, with that careful, recalibrating expression, like a man doing math he wasn't sure he trusted. He reached across the table and put his hand over mine. Just that. His hand over mine, warm and heavy and certain, the way he did things. Without fanfare, without preamble, just the fact of it. My heart did the undignified thing again. I looked at his hand. I looked at his face. He was watching me with an expression that was no longer careful, that had gone past careful into something open and a little afraid and completely steady all at once. I turned my hand over under his, palm to palm. We sat like that for a long moment. The music low, the kitchen warm, 22 years of a street between us collapsed into a kitchen table and 2 hands. And I thought, this is it. This is the thing. This is what the wave was always pointing toward. And I was 53 years old and I had no idea what I was doing and I didn't care. Then my phone rang. I should have ignored it. I know that. In the version of this story where I am braver or stupider or less conditioned by 53 years of being careful, I ignore the phone and let whatever was about to happen happen. But it rang, and I flinched, and I looked at the screen and it was my sister Carol calling from Phoenix, which was unusual enough at 9 on a Friday that I picked up. Our mother had fallen. She was fine, bruised, not broken. But Carol was panicked and needed to talk through the logistics of what came next. And the call took 20 minutes. And when I finally hung up, the kitchen felt different. Not cold, but different. Ray had taken his hand back at some point during the call and was washing up the bowls at the sink, his back to me, and the moment had closed over like water. Everything okay? He asked without turning around. My mom fell. She's all right. Carol's... I stopped. She's fine. Good, he said, still at the sink. I stood up. I put on my jacket. I said goodnight and he said goodnight, and I crossed the street and stood in my kitchen in the dark for a long time. The next morning I came over at 8 as usual. He poured the coffee as usual. We talked about the weather, actually the weather for the first time in weeks, and the Henderson's dog, and a piece in the paper about the highway construction. Everything was normal. Everything was fine. Fine. There was that word again. I went home and sat with my cold coffee and understood that we had stepped up to something and then stepped back from it, and were now, by unspoken mutual agreement, pretending the step hadn't happened. I understood this. I had spent 53 years being an expert at exactly this. What I did not understand was why, this time, I could not make myself be okay with it. Yes, 3 days passed. The mornings continued, but they were careful in a way they hadn't been before. Polite, pleasant, a half step further apart than usual. I noticed the distance. I suspected he noticed it too. Neither of us named it. On the 4th day, I came over and he wasn't there. I knocked. No answer. His truck was in the driveway. I stood on the porch for a moment and then went home and told myself it was fine. People went for walks, people had errands, people didn't owe their neighbor across the street an explanation for their whereabouts. The next morning, I didn't go over. I stood at my window with my coffee and I watched his porch. And at 7:15, he came out in the gray robe and picked up the newspaper and looked across the street, and I was standing far enough back from the window that I wasn't sure he could see me. He stood there a moment longer than usual. Then he went back inside. I had not felt this stupid since I was 17 years old, and I resented it thoroughly. The morning after that, I didn't go to the window at all. I made my coffee and sat at the kitchen table and read the news on my phone and tried to feel normal about the fact that the habit I'd had for 22 years, the wave, then the coffee, then the walks, had apparently ended the same way it had begun. Quietly, without discussion, through the slow withdrawal of two people who didn't know how to say what they actually meant. Except that this time I knew exactly what I meant. That was the difference. That was the thing that made sitting at the kitchen table with my phone feel like an act of cowardice rather than just a Tuesday morning. My phone buzzed. A text from a number I'd had for 3 weeks and had not yet assigned a contact name to because naming it had felt like admitting something. Haven't seen you. Everything all right? I looked at it for a long time. Then I put the phone face down on the table and poured my coffee down the sink and got my keys. I didn't go to his house. I got in my car and drove. No destination, just the specific need to be moving, to have something to do with my hands and my eyes that wasn't standing in a kitchen thinking about a text message. I drove out past the edge of town where the subdivisions thinned out and the fields started. The flat October fields that stretched to a horizon so wide, it felt like an argument. I drove for 40 minutes, and then I pulled over on the shoulder of a county road and sat there with the engine off and the windows up, and I had the kind of conversation with myself that I'd been avoiding for approximately 22 years. Here is what I said to myself, alone on a county road in October, at the age of 53. You know what this is. You have known what this is for a long time. Not since 3 weeks ago, not since Tuesday when the light was on. Longer than that. You have known it since the first morning you went to the window before you'd made the coffee. Since the first time you came home from a trip and felt something ease when you saw his truck in the driveway. You have organized your life around a 30-second wave with this man for 22 years. And you have called it a habit and a routine and a good thing, and you have never once called it what it actually was. And now he has put his hand over yours in a warm kitchen on a Friday night, and you got a phone call and you retreated, because retreating is what you know how to do. And he has texted you to ask if you're all right, which is its own kind of courage from a man who doesn't use words easily, and you are sitting on the side of a road in October being afraid. You are 53 years old. You are allowed to be afraid. You are not allowed to let it be the last word. I started the car and drove back. He was in the backyard when I got there. I could see him through the gate, at the workbench, sanding something, the rocking chair maybe, his back to me. I stood at the gate for a moment and watched him work. There was something about the way he moved when he was working, unhurried, methodical, completely present, that I had always been able to see from across the street but had never been this close to. It was a good way to move through the world. I had spent 53 years moving through it differently, always slightly ahead of myself, always half thinking about the next thing. And watching him sand a piece of wood in his backyard, I felt the specific envy of someone who recognizes a quality they don't have and aren't sure it's too late to learn. He heard the gate, turned around. He didn't say anything. Neither did I for a moment. We looked at each other across the yard with the particular quality of attention that had been building between us since the first morning in the kitchen. That full, careful, nothing being wasted attention. And then I walked across the yard and stopped a few feet from him. "I'm sorry," I said, "for disappearing." He set down the sandpaper, leaned against the workbench, crossed his arms in the way he did when he was thinking. Not defensive, just contained. "You don't owe me." "Ray!" "Yeah. I'm not good at this," I said. "I want you to know that going in. I am specifically, demonstrably bad at this particular thing, and I've had 53 years of evidence to support that, and I think you should have the information." Something moved across his face. Not a smile yet. The thing that comes before a smile, the decision to let one happen. "What particular thing?" he said. Not quite a question. Saying what I mean, when it matters. I looked at the half-finished rocking chair. Showing up. Staying. He was quiet for a moment. "You showed up every morning for 3 weeks," he said. And then I stopped. "And then you came back." I looked at him. He was looking at me with that steady, recalibrating expression. The one I'd been cataloging, without meaning to, since the first morning in the kitchen. Patient, unhurried, the way he sanded wood. "Danny," he said, "why did you come back just now? Not the mornings. Right now. Why?" The October light was doing its thing, golden and elegiac, the light of late afternoon in a season that knows its ending. It came through the bare branches of the oak at the back of his yard and fell across the workbench and across his face, and I stood there in it and understood that the answer to his question was the simplest thing in the world and had been the simplest thing in the world for 22 years, and the only thing that had ever complicated it was me. "Because I don't want to go back to the wave," I said. "I don't want to stand at a window and watch your porch and call that enough. I did that for 22 years and it was something. It was better than nothing. But it's not." I stopped. Tried again. "I'm 53 years old and I have been careful my entire life and I'm tired of careful." He uncrossed his arms, straightened up from the workbench. "Yeah," he said quietly. "Me too." He crossed the few feet between us. Stopped close. Closer than the workbench, closer than the kitchen table, closer than we'd been since the shoulder moment that I'd been replaying with some regularity. He looked at me with an expression that had gone past careful entirely and arrived somewhere that made my chest do the thing it had been doing since the first morning I walked through his door. He put his hand on the side of my face. Warm. Rough from the sandpaper. Certain. I put my hand over his. The same gesture as the kitchen table, reversed. His hand and mine. Mine over his, palm to palm. Except now we were standing in his backyard in the October light, and there was nothing left to pretend about. "Ray," I said. "I know," he said. "Me too." And then he kissed me. Quietly. Without drama. The way Ray Calloway did most things. Without fanfare. Without preamble. With complete and unhurried attention. His hand still on my face. Mine still over his. The oak tree doing its thing with the light. The rocking chair half finished on the workbench behind him. I had waited 22 years for this without knowing I was waiting. Standing there in his backyard at 53, I understood that the waiting had not been wasted. That everything that had led here, the wave and the mornings and the walks and the chili and the phone call and the 3 days of retreat and the county road and the gate, all of it had been the thing itself, not prologue, not delay. The thing itself in the form it was always going to take for two men like us, on a street like this, in a life built as carefully as ours had been. He pulled back after a moment, looked at me. "You're going to overthink this," he said. Not an accusation, a statement of fact, the way he stated facts, plainly without judgment, with the faint undertone of someone who has decided to find it endearing rather than exhausting. "Probably," I said. "I know." He dropped his hand from my face but didn't step back. "I'm going to let you." "That's very generous." "I'm a generous person." I laughed. He almost smiled. That almost smile that I now understood was, for Ray Calloway, the equivalent of a full laugh for anyone else, and which I had apparently been collecting without realizing it for years. "Come inside," he said. "I'll make coffee. It's 4 in the afternoon." "I know what time it is, Danny." I followed him inside. He made coffee. We sat at the kitchen table. The light outside went from gold to gray as the afternoon ended, and we talked and didn't talk and talked again, and at some point his hand found mine on the table and stayed there, and neither of us moved it. And the refrigerator hummed, and the street outside went quiet the way streets go quiet on weekday evenings when everyone is home. At 7 o'clock, I said I should probably go home for dinner. He said I could stay for dinner. I said I didn't want to impose. He gave me the look, the one for when he thought I was being foolish, and got up and opened the refrigerator. "I have eggs," he said, "and some leftover rice. And I think there's still some of that chili." The chili that started all this, if you want to look at it that way. I do want to look at it that way. The chili is load-bearing. He turned from the refrigerator and looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen before. Open, unguarded. The expression of a man who has put down something heavy and is only now realizing how long he was carrying it. It lasted only a second. Then he turned back to the refrigerator. "Eggs," he said, "unless you have strong feelings about eggs." "No strong feelings about eggs," I said. "Good." He cooked. I sat at the table and watched him move around the kitchen with that same unhurried competence he brought to everything. And I thought about 22 years of mornings and waves and cold coffee at a window. And I thought about the county road and the October fields. And I thought about how strange it was that the biggest thing that had ever happened to me had happened in increments so small that I almost hadn't noticed until I was already inside it. Almost, but not quite. I went home at 9. He walked me to the door, which was, I was realizing, a thing he did. A small ceremony of it, the walking to the door. And we stood in the hallway by the coats for a moment. "Tomorrow morning," he said. "Tomorrow morning," I agreed. He looked at me for a moment in the hallway light. Steady, certain, the way he looked at things he'd decided about. "Danny." "Yeah." "I'm glad your light was on." I stopped, looked at him. "Your light," I said. "My light was off. Your light was on. That's why I came over." He looked at me steadily. "I know," he said. "I turned mine on purpose. Left it on. Figured if you ever decided to cross the street, that was as far as I knew how to go." The hallway was very quiet. 22 years, I said. "I'm a patient man. You left your porch light on." "Every night," he said simply. "In case." I stood in his hallway and looked at this man. This patient, quiet, sawdust-smelling man who had left his porch light on every night for 22 years in case. And felt something shift in my chest, with the slow tectonic certainty of something that has been moving for a very long time, finally arriving where it was always going. "Good night, Ray," I said. "Good night, Danny." I crossed the street. I went inside. I stood at my kitchen window and looked at his house, and at 7:15 exactly, as if on a timer, his porch light went off. For the first time in 22 years, I understood why. I did not sleep well that night, but it was the best kind of not sleeping. The kind where you're too aware of being alive to bother with unconsciousness. I lay in my bed and looked at the ceiling and thought about a man across the street who had left his porch light on every night for 22 years in case. And the thinking was not anxious the way my thinking usually was. It was something else. Something that felt, if I was honest with myself, and I was trying, at 53, to be more honest with myself, like being exactly where I was supposed to be for the first time in a very long time. I thought about Karen, not with regret, or not only with regret, but with a kind of retrospective clarity that the long view sometimes gives you. She had been right. Some part of me had always been somewhere else. She just hadn't known, and I hadn't known, that the somewhere else was 30 feet away across a residential street in the Midwest, drinking coffee and picking up a newspaper and waving at me every morning in a gray robe. I thought about the 22 years, the shape of them, the long, quiet accumulation of mornings, each one unremarkable on its own, each one adding to something I hadn't had a name for. What was it worth, I wondered, to have spent that long loving something quietly? Was it a waste? It didn't feel like a waste. It felt like it had been, in its way, a kind of faithfulness, to something I sensed but couldn't name, to the possibility of him, to the idea that some things were worth waiting for even when you didn't know you were waiting. At 6:15, I got up and made coffee. At 7, I was at the window. At 7:14, his door opened, and he came out in the gray robe and bent to pick up the newspaper from the bottom step. He straightened. He looked across the street. I raised my hand. He raised his, and then, for the first time in 22 years, he crossed the street. I had the door open before he knocked. He was standing on my porch in the gray robe and bare feet with the newspaper tucked under his arm, and an expression that was several things at once. Uncertain and certain, tentative and resolved. The expression of a man who had made a decision and was standing inside it. "First time on this porch," he said. "First time," I agreed. He looked at the porch for a moment. The 2 chairs I'd had out there for years and never sat in. The pot of something that had stopped being a plant about 6 years ago and was now just a pot of dry soil that I kept meaning to address. The wind chime Carol had given me for Christmas in 2015 that I found mildly annoying but had never taken down. "Nice porch," he said. "It's really not." "No," he agreed, "but it could be." I stood back from the door. He came inside. His reaction to my house was the same as mine had been to his, the careful attention of someone filing things away. The bookshelves that lined the hallway, which were organized in a system that made sense to me and no one else. The kitchen, which was cleaner than his but had the specific sterility of a room that didn't get used for anything but the most necessary functions. The coffee maker, the good one, the one I'd spent more money on than was probably reasonable for a man who lived alone. "You have a lot of books," he said in the hallway. "I know. Have you read them all?" "Most of them. Some of them are aspirational." He pulled one out, unhurriedly, with the same focused attention he brought to everything, and looked at the cover. Put it back precisely where he'd found it. You keep them in order, he said. Alphabetical by author, within sections. What are the sections? I told him. He listened the way he listened, fully, without the particular restlessness of people waiting for their turn to talk. When I finished, he nodded once as if I'd told him something useful. That makes sense, he said, which, from Ray Calloway, felt like high praise. We went to the kitchen. I poured him coffee in my second-best mug. Not my mug, which was non-negotiable, but a good one. And we sat at my kitchen table, which was the same shape as his butt lighter wood, and we had the same kind of morning we'd been having across the street, except that it was at my table, in my kitchen, with my window. And the view was different from this side. I could see his house from here, his porch. The 2 chairs on it, which were better than my 2 chairs, I now understood, because he had made them. You made the porch chairs, I said. He looked up. Years ago, yeah. I always thought they were nice chairs. You could see them from across the street? Ray, I could see everything from across the street. That was the whole problem. He looked at me for a moment with that expression, the one that had the smile inside it that hadn't decided yet whether to come out. Not a problem, he said quietly. No, I said, not anymore. Here is what I hadn't known about Ray Calloway, that I learned in the weeks and then the months that followed. He read. Not in the organized, categorized way I read. He had books all over the house in the way of someone who read wherever he happened to be sitting when the urge struck, and left them there when he was done. I found this mildly alarming, and then found myself doing it too, leaving my books in his kitchen, on his workbench, on the arm of the porch chair where I'd started sitting with my morning coffee when the weather allowed. He was funny. Not in the loud, performing way of people who need you to know they're funny. In the quiet, deadpan way of someone who said one thing and meant something else and trusted you to catch it. I caught it about 70% of the time in the beginning. By spring, I was catching almost all of it, and he'd started giving me a look when I missed one. A look that said, "You'll get there," which was more patience than most people had ever extended to me about anything. He worried about Tommy. Not in a way he said directly, in the way he mentioned Portland, the way he noted the time zone difference, the way he pulled out his phone sometimes in the middle of a conversation to look at a photo his daughter-in-law had sent of the grandchildren. Emma had lost her first tooth. Jake had learned to ride a bike. Ray showed me both photos with the expression of a man who was glad and sad simultaneously, and had made his peace with that being the only available option. You should visit, I said one evening in November, looking at a photo of Jake on a bicycle with the specific triumph of a 6-year-old who has accomplished something enormous. I'm going at Christmas, he said. Tommy asked. Good. He was quiet for a moment. You could come, he said. Not casually, with the particular weight of a sentence that has been considered before being spoken. If you wanted. I told Tommy about you. He said. He paused. He said he'd like to meet you. I looked at him across the kitchen table. You told Tommy about me. I did. What did you tell him? Ray turned his mug, quarter turn at a time. I told him about the wave, he said, and what came after it. I told him you were my neighbor for 22 years and I had been. He paused. I told him I had been paying attention for a long time and that things had changed and that I was glad they had. He looked up. He said it was about time. Was his exact words? His exact words. I thought about Tommy, the 7-year-old in the yard, the 30-year-old who visited twice a year in a car with out-of-state plates, the man who had apparently known or guessed something about his father that I hadn't figured out for 2 decades. Smart kid, I said. Man, Ray said. He's a good man. Yeah, I said. He is. Akatis. I went to Portland for Christmas. I want to say something about this that I'm not sure I have the right words for. I had spent 53 years being careful about what I let matter to me. Careful about proximity, careful about want, careful about the specific vulnerability of showing up somewhere and being seen in the context of something real. I had kept my life clean and organized and comprehensible, like the bookshelves, like the accounting, like the measured distance of a wave across a street. Portland was not that. Portland was Ray's son, opening the door and looking at his father and then at me, with the expression of someone confirming a theory they'd held for a while, and then shaking my hand and saying, "Danny, glad you came," in a voice that meant it. It was Emma showing me her gap-toothed smile within 30 seconds of meeting me and informing me that her cat's name was Gerald, and that Gerald was very smart. It was Jake demonstrating the bike riding for my benefit in the driveway, while Ray stood beside me with his hands in his jacket pockets and watched his grandson with an expression I'd never seen from across the street. Pure, uncomplicated joy. The kind that costs nothing because there's nothing defensive left in it. It was Ray's daughter-in-law Laura taking me aside in the kitchen on the second evening, while the others were watching something on television and saying, quietly and with the directness of a woman who did not waste time, "He's different since you. Better different. I don't know what you did, but thank you for doing it." I said I hadn't done anything. She gave me the look of a woman who had heard that kind of modesty before and had no patience for it. I decided I liked her very much. It was Ray and me in the guest room of Tommy's house on the third night. The house quiet around us. The Portland rain doing what Portland rain does, and Ray saying, in the darkness, in that plain, certain way of his, "I've never brought anyone here before, since Linda." "I know," I said. "I wanted to." "I know that too." He was quiet. The rain on the window. The particular quality of darkness in an unfamiliar room that makes honesty easier. The same way the tent and the cabin and the overnight train have always been where the real things get said. "I was scared," he said. "After the chili. When you stopped coming over, I thought I'd—" He stopped. "I thought I'd moved too fast, done the wrong thing." "You didn't," I said. "I know that now." "You did exactly the right thing," I said. "It was me. It's always been me. I'm the one who took 22 years to cross the street." "You crossed it," he said. Simply. As if that were the only relevant fact, and maybe it was. I found his hand in the dark. His fingers closed around mine without hesitation. That same certainty, that same unhurried completeness that was so distinctly Ray, that it had become, in the month since October, the thing I measured steadiness against. "Ray." "Yeah." "The porch light," I said. "Are you going to keep leaving it on?" A pause. I could feel him thinking, which was something I'd gotten good at. The particular quality of his silence when something was being considered rather than avoided. "Depends," he said. "On what?" "On whether you keep coming home before dark." I lay there in the dark of Tommy's guest room in Portland, with the rain on the window, and Ray's hand in mine, and the word home doing something in my chest that I didn't have a clinical term for. It was not a word I had used about Alderman Street before. It had been an address, a location, a place I happened to live. It had not been home in the specific sense of the word, the sense that means where you return to, where the light is on, where someone knows the sound of your car in the driveway. It was that now. "Yeah," I said. "I'll keep coming home before dark." We flew back on the 27th. The cab dropped us at Alderman Street at 9 in the evening, and we stood on the sidewalk between our two houses with our bags and the particular tiredness of travel and the particular gladness of being back somewhere familiar. The street was quiet. Mrs. Patterson's Christmas lights were still up. The Kellermans had a new car in the driveway, which Ray noted with the mild interest of someone who kept track of these things. His porch light was on. He'd put it on a timer while we were away. We stood there on the sidewalk and looked at it for a moment. "Come over tomorrow morning," he said. "I'll be there at 8. Bring your mug." "I always bring my mug." "I know," he said. "I like that you always bring your mug." He picked up his bag, walked up his porch steps. At the door he turned and looked at me across the street. The same look, the same distance, the same two houses and the same Alderman Street between us. Except that nothing about it was the same at all. Every single thing about it had changed, slowly and then all at once, the way things change when they've been ready to change for a long time and are only waiting for someone to finally cross the street. He raised his hand. I raised mine. He went inside. The door closed. A moment later, through the kitchen window, I could see the light come on, warm and amber, the specific color of his kitchen at night, a color I now knew from the inside. I stood on the sidewalk a moment longer. The December air was cold and clean and smelled of someone's fireplace down the block. Above Alderman Street, the sky was doing what Midwest winter skies do, vast and dark and absolutely indifferent to the small particular lives being lived underneath it. I picked up my bag, walked up my own porch steps. At the door, I stopped and looked back at his house. At the porch light, amber and steady. The light he had left on every night for 22 years in case. I thought, I am 53 years old. I wasted 22 years on a wave when I could have crossed the street. I am going to spend the rest of my life being furious about those 22 years and grateful for every single morning of them, because they were the road, and this is where the road went, and the road went somewhere good. I went inside. I put my bag down. I made a cup of tea I didn't really want because I needed something to do with my hands while I stood at the kitchen window and watched his light. At 9:47, his porch light went off. I smiled at the dark porch, at the quiet street, at the specific small miracle of an ordinary life on an ordinary street that had turned out, against all of my careful expectations, to contain exactly what I needed. 30 feet away, across a strip of asphalt, behind a door I should have knocked on years ago, I turned off my kitchen light and went to bed. In the morning, I would cross the street. I would bring my mug. He would have the coffee on. We would sit at the table and talk about nothing in particular for 2 hours, and it would be the best 2 hours of the day. Same as it had been every morning since October, same as I understood it would be for as long as there were mornings on Alderman Street. Tomorrow morning, and the one after that, and the one after that. The man across the street moved in on a Saturday in September. I know it was a Saturday because I was home. I was always home on Saturdays, Linda and I both were. It was the day we did the things that needed doing. The yard and the grocery store and the particular domestic maintenance that a house requires, and that neither of us discussed. We just did it. The way we did most things in those years. I was in the driveway cleaning out the truck bed when the U-Haul pulled up across the street and a man got out. Medium build. Dark hair. The look of someone who was trying to appear more settled than he was. He had that specific quality of a person who had recently been through something. Not broken, not visibly damaged, but reorganized. Like a room after furniture has been moved. Everything's still there, just in different places. He looked across the street. I nodded. He went inside with his boxes. I went back to the truck bed and thought about him for the rest of the afternoon, in a way that I did not examine too closely, because I was 31 years old and married and not in the habit of examining certain things too closely. It was a habit I developed young and maintained carefully. It had served me well enough. Or it had served something. I was not always sure what. That evening at dinner, Linda said there was a new neighbor across the street. I said I'd seen him. She said he looked nice. I said he seemed fine. She looked at me for a moment with the particular attention she sometimes turned on me, the attention that saw more than I was comfortable with. And then she went back to her food and we talked about Tommy's school thing on Tuesday, and I did not think about the man across the street again that evening. I was not entirely successful at this. Or, the wave started within the first week. I'm not sure which of us began it. I think it simply happened. The way things happen when two people are in the same place at the same time often enough. He came out in the mornings. I came out in the mornings. We saw each other. Someone raised a hand. The other one raised a hand back. Here is what I knew about Danny from the wave, and from watching, not in a way I would have admitted to, but in the way you can't help watching something you're trying not to look at. He was precise. Everything about him was precise. The time he came out, the way he held his coffee mug, the specific quality of his attention when he looked at something. He was the kind of man who noticed things and filed them away without making a production of it. I recognized this because I was the same way. And you recognize your own habits in other people the way you recognize your own handwriting. He was alone. Not sad, alone. Contained alone, which is different. He had visitors occasionally, a woman I figured for a sister based on the resemblance and the ease between them. He had friends, I thought, though they didn't come around much. Mostly he came and went with the regularity of someone who had organized his life around a specific kind of solitude and had made his peace with it. I understood that kind of peace. I had it too, in a different form. I did not examine what it meant that the part of my morning I looked forward to most was 30 seconds on the porch with a man who was 40 feet away and never said a word. Seer. Linda left in 2008. I want to be fair about this because she deserves fairness. She was not wrong to leave. She had been right about a lot of things for a long time, and the leaving was just the last of a series of things she had been right about while I had been carefully not paying attention. She said, the night before she took her boxes out, that she felt like she'd spent 15 years trying to reach a man who was standing just slightly out of reach. Not cruel, not cold, not absent. Just not fully there. Like there was some part of him that had always been reserved for something she wasn't. I said I didn't know what she meant. She looked at me with the specific patience of a woman who has stopped expecting to be understood and has moved on to simply needing to be done. Yes, you do, she said. And that was that. She wasn't wrong. I did know. I just hadn't known how to do anything about what I knew, which is a particular kind of cowardice that I had dressed up as privacy for so long that I'd almost convinced myself they were the same thing. The morning after she left, I came out at 7:15 as usual. Danny came out across the street as usual. We raised our hands. I went back inside and stood in the kitchen of a house that was now just mine, and I drank my coffee, and I did not allow myself to feel anything other than the specific sadness of a marriage that had ended quietly because both people had been too careful to save it. The wave continued. I found that it helped. Tommy knew. I should say that clearly, because it matters and because he deserved better from me than the years of not saying it. He knew in the way that children know things, not through information, not through anything said, but through the particular attention of a kid watching his father over years. He told me once when he was maybe 25 and we were driving back from a hardware store, and he was feeling the looseness of being in a moving car that makes certain conversations possible, that he'd always known I was a little different. Not in a bad way. Just that there was something I carried that other dads didn't seem to carry. I said I didn't know what he meant. He said, "Dad, you don't have to." And we drove the rest of the way home and never talked about it again. But something had shifted between us. Something had been set down that I'd been holding for a long time, and he'd seen me set it down, and he hadn't made me pick it back up. That was the best gift he ever gave me, and I don't think he knows it. He knew about Danny too, though not by name. He'd noticed, over the years of visits, the way I looked at a certain point across the street when I thought no one was paying attention. He had the good sense not to say anything until the October when I called him and said there was someone I wanted to tell him about. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The guy across the street?" I said yes. He said, "Dad, it's about time." I said I knew. He said, "Bring him for Christmas." I said I'd ask. I did not tell him that the asking had required 3 separate attempts and a significant amount of staring at the kitchen table before I got the words out in the right order. Some things a son doesn't need to know. The porch light. I should explain the porch light. It started in 2003, which was about 2 years after Danny moved in, and about the time I had finished pretending that the wave was just a wave and started understanding it for what it actually was. I'd been leaving the light on because I was working late, a job in the next county that had me coming home after dark, and I'd gotten in the habit of leaving it on so I could see the steps. When the job ended, I kept leaving it on. Not consciously at first. Just kept leaving it on. And then one night I was turning it off and I caught myself looking across the street at Danny's dark windows, and I understood something that I was not going to say out loud to anyone, least of all myself, but that I was going to carry in the most honest part of me for as long as it needed to be carried. The light was on for him, not in any way he'd ever know, not in any way I intended to do anything about, just on, in case. A small, private act of acknowledgement of something I was never going to name. I was a practical man, a man who built things with his hands and lived in the specific reality of what was in front of him. And I had somehow become the kind of man who left his porch light on every night for 22 years as a gesture that no one would ever see or understand. I was okay with that. It was enough to know. The night Tommy called about Portland, I lay awake for hours. Not because of Portland. I'd been thinking about Portland for a week and had more or less made my peace with going. It was a practical decision. Tommy was there. The grandkids were there. I was 61 years old, and the house was large and silent in a way that had stopped being peaceful and become something heavier. I had been going to say yes. Then Tommy called and I heard his voice and I said I'd think about it. And afterward, I lay there in the dark and tried to understand why the decision that had felt settled for a week had suddenly become unsettled. And the answer was so simple and so stubborn that I almost laughed at myself in the dark. I didn't want to leave Danny. Not Danny who I knew. I barely knew him, in any conventional sense. Danny the wave. Danny the 30 seconds. Danny the careful, precise man across the street who had been my first thought in the morning and my last thought at night for 22 years, without either of us ever saying a word about it. I didn't want to leave that, even though that was nothing. Even though that was 30 seconds a day and a hand raised across 40 feet of asphalt. I left the porch light on all night. I did not sleep. In the morning, I came out late and I did not turn the light off, and I went back inside and I sat at the kitchen table and I thought about what it would mean, at 61, to finally do the thing I had spent 22 years not doing. At 9:30, I heard a knock at the door. Ayo. Here is what I thought when I opened the door and saw him standing on my porch for the first time. I thought, of course it was him. Of course it was this morning, this way. Not some arranged thing, not some planned conversation, but Danny standing on my porch because the light was on and he had noticed and he had crossed the street. Of course, that was how it happened. It was exactly how it was always going to happen with these two particular people on this particular street after this particular amount of time. He said, "Your light was on." I almost told him then. About the 22 years of it. About the 2003 job and the habit that stayed and the private act of leaving it on in case. I almost said it all right there in the doorway before we'd even had coffee. Instead, I said, "You want to come in?" He said, "Yeah." He said, "I do." And I stepped back from the door and he came inside and I made coffee, the same as I had every morning for 22 years. Except that this time there were two mugs on the table and a man sitting across from me who I had been paying attention to for so long that I knew the particular way he held a mug. Both hands, close to his chest, the way people hold things they don't want to spill. We talked for 2 hours. It was easy in a way I hadn't expected and probably should have. We had been watching each other for 22 years after all. We knew the shape of each other, if not the content. The content just needed somewhere to go. When he left, he stood at the door and said, "Let me know what you decide about Portland." I said, "Come back tomorrow for coffee." He said, "Yeah, I want." I closed the door. I stood in the hallway for a moment. Then I went to the kitchen window and watched him cross the street, watched him go up his porch steps, watched his door close, and I turned off the porch light at 10:47 in the morning because for the first time in 22 years, I didn't need it anymore. He had crossed the street. He was coming back tomorrow. The light had done what I put it there to do. I am not a man who talks about his feelings. This is not news to anyone who has spent more than 20 minutes in my company. I was raised by a man who expressed love primarily through showing up and doing the necessary thing, and I inherited that language and spoke it for 61 years before I learned, slowly and late, and with significant help from a man who read books in alphabetical order and brought his own mug, that there were other languages available and it was not too late to learn one. What I can tell you is this. There is a kind of happiness that is quiet, not the happiness of events, of weddings and births and arrivals, the happiness that announces itself. The other kind. The happiness of a Tuesday morning in a warm kitchen with coffee and someone who knows how you take it. The happiness of a walk around the block with a person who notices the same things you notice and doesn't need to say so out loud. The happiness of a porch in the evening, 2 chairs, the street going quiet, nothing required. I had not known I was missing this until I had it. Or I had known and had not let myself want it, which is a distinction that matters less than I used to think it did. Danny crossed the street in October. By December, he had a key. Not because we discussed it. He'd been coming over every morning for 2 months, and one morning he came and I was in the backyard and he let himself in and made the coffee and had it on the table by the time I came inside. And it seemed so natural and so right that I got a copy made that afternoon and handed it to him without explanation, and he took it without asking for one. That was us. That was the language we'd developed over 22 years without knowing we were developing it. The language of showing up, of noticing, of the small certain gesture that doesn't need words because the words are already understood. He asked me once in the spring what I had thought about all those years when I watched him from across the street. We were on the porch, his porch, which he had started using more since he'd repainted it in March, and the evening was that specific May evening that comes after a long winter, the kind that feels like a promise being kept. "I thought about what you were like," I said, "on the inside. Whether you were as quiet in there as you were out here, or whether there was a lot going on that didn't show." "And? A lot going on," I said. "I figured." He laughed. The real one, not the polite one. The one that came out when he wasn't managing it. I had been collecting that laugh since October and intended to keep collecting it for as long as he'd let me. "You were right," he said. "I usually am," I said, "about the things I pay attention to." He looked at me. "You paid attention to me for 22 years," he said. "I did. From across the street, that's where you were." He shook his head slowly. Not in disagreement, in the way of someone accepting something they don't entirely have words for. The May evening did its thing around us. Down the block, Mrs. Patterson was watering her tomatoes. The Nguyen twins went past on bikes, too fast, the way they always went past on bikes. "Ray," he said. "Yeah. I'm sorry it took me so long." I looked at him. At this man I had watched from a window for 22 years, who was now sitting on my neighbor's porch, which had become his porch, which had in some quiet way become our porch, who brought his own mug and knew where the coffee was and had a key and was, in every way that mattered, already home. Danny, I said. Yeah. You got here. He was quiet for a moment. Yeah, he said. I did. The street went quiet the way streets go quiet on May evenings when the light is low and warm and the day is finishing itself gently. We sat on the porch and didn't say anything else for a while, and the not saying was the same as it had always been. Full and easy, and ours. At some point, I reached over and turned on the porch light, not because it was dark yet, not because we needed it, just because it was a habit. And some habits, the right ones, the ones that were always pointing somewhere true even when you didn't know where they were pointing, some habits you keep.